Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into what is essentially a high-stakes political chess match that completely reshaped the Indian nationalist movement between 1934 and 1937. We're going to look at the fierce internal debates, the shifting tactics, and the dramatic British legislative maneuvers that defined this absolutely critical window in history. All right, let's quickly open up the playbook for today. We'll be covering pausing the revolution, the strategy tug-of-war, the 1935 British curveball, the autonomy illusion, the power paradox, and wrapping up with the electoral verdict. Let's get into it. Kicking things off with Section 1, Pausing the Revolution, the 1934 Dilemma. Following the withdrawal of the civil disobedience movement, the nationalists entered this suddenly quiet truce phase. And this quiet actually brought about a pretty serious identity crisis.
Without an active mass protest to channel all that energy into, what do you actually do? To figure out their next move, the movement basically fractured into three distinct camps. Camp 1 wanted to stick to social, constructive work along Gandhian lines. Camp 2 argued for a constitutional struggle, essentially entering the legislative councils and fighting from the inside. But Camp 3, which was driven by a really strong leftist trend, wanted to scrap the pause altogether and resume mass, non-constitutional struggle immediately.
Moving right along to Section 2, the strategy tug-of-war. This was a period of intense ideological friction between the absolute titans of the movement. The core dilemma they faced was simple, but honestly it was profound. How do you fight imperialism when you're supposed to be on a break? Just imagine your revolution is forced onto pause. How are you going to keep that momentum alive without completely burning out your base?
A clear strategic divide popped up really fast. On one side, you've got Gandhi. He's championing what he called the STS strategy, which stands for struggle, truce, struggle. His logic makes a lot of practical sense, right? The masses literally just need a breather to recoup their strength before jumping into the next big fight. But on the other side, you have Jawaharlal Nehru pushing for the SV, or struggle victory strategy. Nehru is arguing that the time for truces is completely over, and he felt the movement required continuous, non-stop confrontation until imperialism was totally overthrown.
So how do you resolve a deadlock like that? Well, Gandhi ended up taking a super pragmatic approach. He basically acknowledged that, sure, parliamentary politics wasn't going to magically win them freedom on its own, but it offered a really productive outlet. It was a clever way to support council entry just to keep activists occupied and energized without entirely buying into the British constitutional system.
And you know what? This tactical retreat paid off incredibly fast. In May of 1934, they set up a parliamentary board at Patna. Fast forward just a few months to November, and the Congress fights the elections for the Central Legislative Assembly, successfully capturing 45 out of the 75 seats reserved for Indians. That is a solid, undeniable victory right out of the gate.
But of course, the board was about to get flipped. That brings us to Section 3, the 1935 British curveball. Right when nationalist leaders were finding their footing in the Assembly, the British Parliament threw a massive legislative wrench into the whole operation. The Government of India Act of 1935.
This act proposed a really complex all-India federation with a split executive. You had these reserved subjects, think the heavy-hitting stuff like foreign affairs and defense, and those were tightly controlled by the Governor-General, with absolutely zero accountability to the legislature. Meanwhile, transferred subjects were handed over to elected Indian ministers. But it wasn't just a simple split of power. It was a total maze of contradictions. They created a bicameral legislature, but with a super bizarre twist. The upper house was to be elected directly, while the lower house was elected indirectly. It was incredibly convoluted. And hanging over this whole setup was the Governor-General, who kept sweeping residuary powers, including the ultimate veto over literally any piece of legislation.
The real kicker, the crucial detail that completely shatters the illusion of this new federal power, is a staggering number: 80%. Under this new act, a full 80% of the federal budget was completely non-votable by the Assembly. It was effectively locked away from the elected representatives. Crazy, right?
Let's zoom down to the provincial level now with Section 4, the autonomy illusion. While that overarching federal federation never actually materialized, the Act's provincial changes did go into effect, promising a shiny new concept called provincial autonomy.
On paper, it genuinely looked like a huge step forward. It replaced the clunky old diarchy system, provinces gained their legal authority directly from the crown, and were granted independent financial powers. Plus, elected ministers were finally answerable to the provincial legislature. But there was a massive catch. The governor, who, remember, is a crown nominee,
kept these extensive special powers. They could unilaterally take over and just run the administration indefinitely whenever they saw fit.
And just to keep the purse strings nice and tight, even at the provincial level, 40% of the provincial budget was still completely off limits for voting. So autonomy, yes, for sure, but with a really heavy asterisk attached to it.
Because of these total smoke and mirrors concessions, the political landscape fractured once again. A united Congress strongly condemned and outright rejected the act, pointing directly to those severe restrictions. However, other political groups, like the Hindu Mahasabha and the National Liberal Foundation, actually declared themselves in favor of working within the parameters of this new act.
Which sets us up perfectly for Section 5, the power paradox. As the 1937 provincial elections were announced under this new act, a second, super intense strategic debate erupted within the Congress.
And it was all over a massive paradox. If you campaign and you actually win the election, do you take office and govern under a constitution that you fundamentally despise?
The debate over this was fierce. Leftists, including Nehru and Subhash Bose, vehemently opposed accepting office. They argued that the only reason to enter the councils was to create legal deadlocks and basically make the act impossible to run. Opposing them were the folks who argued that, since a massive mass movement just wasn't viable at that exact moment, working inside the legislatures was a necessary, practical, short-term tactic.
And once again, Gandhi steps in as the pragmatic center of gravity. By 1936, he shifted from his initial opposition and was cautiously willing to give Congress ministries a trial run. Ultimately, the party agreed on a really brilliant compromise. Let's fight the elections first on a strong anti-imperialist platform, and we'll just postpone the super divisive decision about actually taking office until after the results are in. And that brings us to our final act, Section 6, the electoral verdict. The party hit the campaign trail incredibly hard to deepen anti-imperialist consciousness. Though, as a fascinating little side note, Gandhi himself didn't actually attend a single election meeting.
But the sheer scale of the outcome was just staggering. It was an absolute landslide victory. Out of the 1,161 seats they contested, the Congress captured 716 of them, gaining a sweeping majority in almost every single province. This overwhelming electoral success did way more than just win them seats. It completely bridged that ideological gap we've been tracking today. It boosted their prestige so much that even fierce critics like Nehru finally reconciled to Gandhi's overarching struggle-truce-struggle playbook. That truce phase had undeniably yielded some enormous political capital. So we've watched them master this strategic chess match, navigating from a totally stalled revolution through some really intense ideological infighting, past British curveballs, all the way to securing an overwhelming electoral victory. But as we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with one incredibly fascinating question to ponder. They won the election, for sure, but operating within a system intentionally designed to keep the ultimate veto firmly in British hands, did they actually win the power? Really think about that one. Thanks for tuning in and keep exploring.